gotcha Christianity videos, Bible contradictions exposed, Christmas errors that your pastor won't preach to you. One of the favorite gotchas is between Matthew and Luke.
Every Christmas, TikTok and YouTube blow up with videos claiming the Bible contradicts itself on page 1 of the New Testament. Why do Matthew and Luke give completely different genealogies for Jesus, different fathers for Joseph, different sons of David, even different directions in time? Is this a mistake, or is something much deeper going on? In this video, we'll uncover what these ancient genealogies were actually designed to tell us, and why the contradiction might be the biggest misunderstood detail in the Christmas story.
Scroll through TikTok or YouTube at this time of year and you'll probably be hit with a whole buffet of gotcha Christianity videos, Bible contradictions exposed, Christmas errors that your pastor won't preach to you. One of the favorite gotchas is between Matthew and Luke, who apparently can't even agree on Jesus' family tree. And to be fair, when you lay these two genealogies side by side, you do see at least 4 big differences. For a start, where they put their genealogies. Matthew has it in chapter 1 right out of the gate. Luke waits till chapter 3 after Jesus' baptism. A second thing is the directions that they run. Matthew goes forward in time from Abraham to Jesus. Then Luke starts with Jesus and goes back not just to Abraham, but all the way to Adam in the Garden of Eden. And then we have the different branches going through David's family line. Matthew chooses to go through David's son Solomon, whereas Luke decides to go through Nathan, a non-royal son of David. And then we have perhaps the greatest difference between the two, and that is the question of who is Joseph's father. Matthew says it is Jacob, whereas Luke says it's Heli. So what's going on here? Did the Bible really trip up on page 1 of the New Testament? Well, before we dive in, I think we just need to step back and demodernize our expectations here. Because for you and I, when we hear the word genealogy today, we tend to picture something like Ancestry.com with a full detailed, no gaps, perfectly chronological list of everyone's great uncle and second cousin twice removed or something like that. That's our world, not the ancient world. And in an ancient world without Google and government databases or archives or DNA testing, a genealogy wasn't just a family tree. It was one of the ways that you could locate yourself within the story of your people, your tribe, your land, your inheritance, even your identity. Hence, ancient genealogies were often heavily stylized, selective, legal documents, even in some cases theological, saying more about who a person is rather than just the fact that they had a long list of ancestors leading up to them in their family. Which means then that the real question before us here isn't so much why don't Matthew and Luke perfectly duplicate one another, but rather what is each writer trying to show us about who Jesus is. Now, to answer that, I want to walk down 3 pathways with you here, 3 kind of angles to the same story: the bloodline, the royal line, and the grace line. First, the bloodline. Let's just start with Luke's genealogy. Luke doesn't give us a family tree straight out of the gate. He waits until chapter 3 after Jesus has been baptized, the heavens are opened up, and God says to Jesus, "You are my son whom I love. With you I am well pleased." And then immediately after that announcement there at the Jordan, like some sort of a smooth segue from God saying, "My son," at the baptism, Luke now launches into his genealogy of Jesus, beginning with Jesus as supposed to be the son of Joseph, the son of Heli, and name after name after name, he goes all the way back through David, through Abraham, to the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the Son of God. So we have baptism, then we have genealogy, and then immediately following that, Luke then goes on to tell us how Jesus was led into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And with this triadic structure here, we see it all coming together.
In this opening, the podcast introduces the problem. Matthew and Luke's genealogies look different in placement, direction, lineage branches, and the name of Joseph's father. But instead of treating these differences as contradictions, the speaker says we need to demodernize our expectations. Ancient genealogies weren't meant to be modern ancestry reports. They were theological, legal, and identity-shaping narratives. The key idea, the real question isn't why don't they match perfectly, but what is each author trying to say about Jesus?
Jesus is the unique Son of God like no one else, and yet he's also fully human, part of the human race as a son of Adam. And as a son of Adam, he faces the same kind of testing that Adam faced in the garden, only this time it's in the wilderness, and this time the son was faithful. So Luke seems to be zooming out the camera, so to speak. He wants us to see where Jesus fits into the big overarching human story from beginning to end, fully sharing our humanity and our struggles, but stepping into that story in a completely unique way as the Son of God. Now, because Luke focuses so much on Jesus' place in human history, some Christian thinkers have suggested this might explain why his genealogy looks different to Matthew's. The idea goes something like this. Maybe Luke is tracing Jesus' line through Mary, his biological connection to David, down the branch of Nathan, ending with Heli, understood to be, in this theory, Mary's father. And Matthew, he's perhaps tracing Jesus' line through Joseph, his legal father, down the royal line through Solomon. So when Luke writes here that Jesus, being as was supposed the son of Joseph, the son of Heli, the suggestion on this theory is that ancient genealogies were normally recorded through men, and if Mary had no brothers, Joseph then could have become her father's legal heir. Hence, Joseph could be called Heli's son in a legal sense, basically a son-in-law relationship treated like a son for the family record.
The speaker admits uncertainty about the exact mechanics of the genealogy, something rare and refreshing. Instead of forcing an answer, he suggests Luke's clear purpose is to anchor Jesus firmly inside the human story. This section argues that even if we can't solve every historical detail, the theological purpose is unmistakable. Jesus enters the real, messy world of human history. I think it's honest to admit when ancient data simply doesn't give us full clarity. But isn't it interesting that the mystery itself pushes us to focus less on factual gaps and more on the overall message? Could the uncertainty actually be part of what makes the story feel more human and more believable?
Now, this idea is historically and culturally plausible. The Old Testament does have precedent where inheritance and family lines run through daughters and their husbands. But if I'm going to lay my cards on the table here, I'm just not that convinced by it. Because, Luke never actually says, here is Mary's genealogy. The text says Joseph, the son of Heli. So turning Luke's list into Mary's line, while plausible, and I understand the intent there, I just think it's a bit like reading an answer to calm a modern worry rather than trying to look for Luke's original intent. So instead of leaning too hard on that theory, I think it's personally better to notice what Luke is clearly doing. He's clearly locating Jesus, the Son of God, right inside the human story, all the way back to Adam in the garden. The exact family mechanics of how that works out, I'm totally okay saying I don't know. But I think what we can say at this point is Jesus is not just floating as a spiritual idea in Luke's account. He steps into the real messy reality of human civilization. And that leads to a second point, the royal line. If Luke gives us the bloodline, then Matthew gives us the royal line. And unlike Luke, who starts in chapter 3, Matthew comes right out of the gate in his gospel with his genealogy like a trumpet blast. Matthew 1:1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. With that one sentence, Matthew is doing a whole lot of work. For a start, Christ isn't just a last name of Jesus, it means Messiah, God's anointed king. For a second thing, Son of David is a royal title. Matthew is saying, in effect, here is the king, Israel, that you have been waiting for. And thirdly, son of Abraham, it ties Jesus back to the promise that through Abraham's family would all the nations of the world be blessed. That's the trumpet blast right out of the gate in Matthew's gospel. And with that still ringing in our ears, Matthew then goes right into his genealogy. 3 sets of 14 generations, from Abraham to David, from David to exile, from exile to Jesus. Now, why this obsession with 3 sets of 14? Well, in English, letters and numbers are separate, but in ancient Hebrew, the letters of the alphabet also double as their numbers. And when you add up the numerical value of the name David in ancient Hebrew, what you get is the number 14. So by arranging the genealogy into 3 sets of 14, Matthew isn't just saying Jesus had some ancestors, he's highlighting, capitalizing, underlining, italicizing theology through genealogy to say David, David, David.
Now the focus shifts to Matthew. Unlike Luke, Matthew wants to present Jesus as royal Messiah, the rightful king of Israel. The structure, 3 sets of 14, signals David through Hebrew numerology. Matthew is emphasizing Jesus' royal identity above all else. He connects Jesus to God's promises to Abraham and David, showing Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel's long-awaited story. It's clear Matthew wasn't trying to hide his agenda. He wanted readers to see Jesus as the promised king. But if Matthew is deliberately shaping the list to highlight David, could it be that genealogy isn't just history, but a kind of royal announcement? And if so, how much freedom did ancient writers have to shape lineage to make a point?
So Luke has shown Jesus really sharing in our humanity as the son of Adam. Matthew wants us to feel in our bones that this same Jesus is the promised son of David. But here's something else. If you read Matthew's list of names slowly, there's one name that would have made any scripturally literate Jew wince: Jeconiah. You see, in a very, very old Hebrew text, Jeremiah 22, God pronounces a curse on this king, that none of his descendants would prosper sitting on David's throne. So at first glance, the inclusion of Jeconiah looks like a problem in the royal line. Like, if Joseph comes from that branch, how can Jesus possibly be the rightful king? But then notice what Matthew does. He doesn't just hide Jeconiah, he includes him. Then immediately after the genealogy, Matthew then goes in to tell us that Jesus is born of Mary by the Holy Spirit. In other words, Joseph is not Jesus' biological daddy. He is Mary's husband and therefore Jesus' legal guardian, legal father, but not the biological source of Jesus born in Bethlehem. What we have here are not Wikipedia-style data dumps, but carefully crafted ancient theology through genealogy. The very name that looks like it might disqualify Jesus actually sets up the way Matthew wants to show us we have a king with a legal claim to David's throne without the weight of Jeconiah's curse. And when you go back now and compare that with Luke's genealogy, it lines up remarkably well, because remember, Luke traces Jesus through Nathan, a non-royal son of David, whereas Matthew goes through Solomon, David's royal successor. In short, what we have between these two genealogies are different hallways in the same house. Luke's bloodline locates Jesus in the human family story. Matthew's royal line locates Jesus in the kingly family story of Israel. But there's still one big difference between the two. If Matthew and Luke are both correct, why do they have a different name for Joseph's father? Matthew 1:16 says Jacob was Joseph's father. Luke 3:23 says Heli.
This part deals with the famous Jeconiah curse, which should disqualify any descendant from ruling. Matthew includes Jeconiah on purpose, but solves the problem by showing Jesus isn't Joseph's biological son. This keeps the royal legal claim without inheriting the curse. The podcast then summarizes both genealogies: Luke, bloodline, humanity; Matthew, royal line, kingship. Different purposes, same Jesus. The idea that Matthew includes a problem name on purpose is surprisingly bold. It's almost like he's saying the tension is part of the point. But if Matthew wasn't afraid of including difficult details, what does that say about how ancient writers viewed truth compared to how we view it today?
Is this an indisputable contradiction? Skeptics may leap to say yes, while some believers may leap to immediately shout no, but I think both moves here rush faster than the evidence allows for. A contradiction is only a contradiction when you have A and not A in the same sense at the same time. Is that what we have here? A, Joseph's father is Jacob. Not A, Joseph's father is Heli. If both statements were claiming the same kind of fatherhood, then yes, this would be a contradiction. But in the ancient world, father language was much more flexible than what it is today. A man back then could be a biological father who physically begot somebody, a legal father who through adoption, inheritance, or guardianship assumed that role, or even a levirate father, a relative who married a childless widow so that the firstborn son would be counted as the heir of the deceased man. See Deuteronomy 25 for more on that. So having two different different fathers on two different documents does not necessarily mean logical contradiction or automatically tell us that the Bible has made an error. What this does do is raise a further question. What kind of father is each gospel talking about? And to answer that, the short answer is, as far as I'm aware, we don't have any way of really knowing, at least with any degree of certainty. One gospel might be using a biological name, another a legal name or a Levirate name. There's arguments for and against, but I just don't think we have enough information to say with any degree of certainty. But what we can say is this: given how ancient kingship and legal customs worked, it is entirely realistic for the same man to appear to have two different fathers on paper through genealogical lists. So the most, therefore, that I think an honest critic could really say on this score is, I am not convinced by your proposed harmonization. And hey, fair enough.
This tackles the biggest criticism. Joseph has two different fathers. The podcast says this isn't a contradiction because ancient fatherhood categories included biological father, legal adoptive father, levirate father, marriage to a relative's widow. Thus, one man could have multiple fathers depending on the legal or family context. The host admits we can't know which category Luke or Matthew used, but insists the text doesn't require assuming a contradiction. Modern people hear father and assume biological. Ancient people didn't. That alone changes the whole discussion. But it also raises another question. If ancient readers didn't see a contradiction here, why do modern readers jump to one instantly? Are we misunderstanding the genre or just expecting the Bible to behave like a modern database?
But to go further and insist Matthew and Luke are logically contradicting one another about Joseph's father, I think that's just to claim something that the evidence does not allow for. Because once you understand how father language and family structures actually functioned in the ancient world, the intellectual ground beneath these dramatic gotcha moments on YouTube and TikTok tend to be more like sinking sand. Again, the real question here isn't, can I solve all of these riddles and puzzles with the limited data that we have? It's, what are Matthew and Luke trying to shout to us about the identity of Jesus? And that leads us to a third point, the grace line. If Luke shows Jesus stepping down into our humanity as a son of Adam, and Matthew shows Jesus stepping into the royal promises of God as the son of David, then the real miracle is what happens when those two lines come together. God the Son became a son of Adam and the son of David, so that the sons and daughters of Adam, like you and me, could become sons and daughters of God. And that invitation doesn't just bring you or me into a mere bloodline or royal line, it grafts us into a grace line. I mean, just consider Matthew once more. For someone writing a Jewish family tree, he does some pretty shocking things. He highlights, for example, 4 Gentile women with messy, complicated stories. Tamar was caught up in scandal involving incest. Rahab was a Canaanite prostitute from Jericho. Ruth was a Moabite outsider. And Bathsheba, she's introduced here as the wife of Uriah, who's forever linked with David's adultery and murder. Matthew could have just gone with safe matriarchs like Sarah or Rebecca or Leah. Instead, though, he leans into the brokenness, the outsiders, the scandal. Why?
Now the topic shifts from harmonizing differences to the theological beauty of the genealogies. Matthew intentionally includes women with painful, complicated pasts, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, instead of the traditional matriarchs. This highlights grace, mercy, and God working through society's outsiders. Now, these messy stories being placed right at the center of Jesus' family tree is honestly powerful. It's like the genealogy itself is preaching grace. But it also makes me wonder, if Jesus' origin story includes the broken and the overlooked, what does that say about the kind of king he came to be?
I think it's because he wants us to see that Jesus' family tree is full of the unexpected, full of people who don't look religious enough, clean enough, good enough, put together enough. And that magnifies grace, undeserved favor. Again, Luke does something similar over in his gospel by tracing all the way back to Adam and placing the genealogy right between the baptism, "You are my son," and the temptation. It seems to be that Luke is making the point that Jesus doesn't just come out to rule over humanity. Jesus comes to stand in with humanity for humanity. He's the faithful son where Adam failed as the son. So Luke's bloodline, Matthew's royal line, they give us a picture of who Jesus is, but bringing them together, we see why Jesus has come. The bloodline shows our condition, the royal line shows our need, and together the grace line shows our rescue as the one who took our lineage now offers us his own. The genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke are not there to trip us up and cause confusion. They're there to preach good news, theology through genealogy, because in the end, they both tell of how Jesus stands at the end of a real line of real people in real stories. God doesn't just look down from above upon our messy. He gets amongst it. He says, I'm going to be born right there in that family, in that story. Behold, the wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. He is at once the baby wrapped in swaddling cloths, laid in a feeding trough because there was no place for him at the inn. Maybe your family tree looks at times more like a jungle, more messy than manageable. The genealogies of Jesus in the Bible are here to remind you that's exactly where God does his best work, with stories like yours and like mine. And that's good news. That's a good news message. It's not just another pop answer to a YouTube or TikTok meme. It's the true gift of Christmas, a savior that you can trust with your life.
The podcast concludes by combining both genealogies into one message. Luke shows the human story. Jesus enters our condition. Matthew shows the royal story. Jesus answers our need. Together, they form a lineage of grace where God steps into real human history with all its messiness. The ending is a pastoral message. God works in the middle of messy stories, not outside them. I like how the podcast brings everything back to a personal point, that God works through imperfect stories. But it also raises a deeper question. If God chose to enter history through a lineage full of chaos and scandal, what does that reveal about how he chooses to enter our lives today?